Hi, Daria. Happy Friday, and welcome to Guild Chat. I'm your host, Ruby, and we're going to be talking some more about the Drakkar encounter today. We talked about it a little bit a few weeks ago and promised you a little bit deeper dive. So we're going to talk with some of the developers who worked on that. Why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves and talk about what you worked on?
Sure. So my name's Cameron Rich. I was the game designer that built Drakkar.
My name's Chris. I was the audio lead for the episode, so I told other people what to do, but I'm here to showcase what they did. Keenan Sieg was the sound designer and implementer. Stan Leparg was the composer, and I just worked to facilitate and do a lot of emailing for those people. Yeah.
So you're here for the shout-outs today?
I'm here for the shout-outs, yeah.
All
I'm
right.
cheerleading other people's good work, which is, I'm very proud of them. So
That's fair. All right.
I'm Lee Bledsoe, the visual effects lead on Guild Wars 2, and I was responsible for maintaining the visual target and the overall budget and management of the team that created the visual effects for this encounter.
Awesome. All right, so if you guys have questions while we're talking through the show, go ahead and drop them in chat, and we'll try to answer some of them at the end, as we have time for. But yeah, let's kind of go way back, months back toward the beginning, and talk a little bit about how the encounter evolved during design and development, and bringing all of those teams into the beginning and having everybody talk together.
Yeah. Okay, so, man.
Way back
Long time.
when. Because you had multiple teams involved working on this from the
We
beginning.
did, yes. And we knew that this was going to be a really, really big project because we haven't done a world boss in a really long time.
Yeah.
And world bosses in our game are epic in scale. They're dynamic feeling in terms of like the way that they impact the environment. And so we knew that this was going to be a big lift. And in order for us to really hit that, especially with the amount of time that we had, everybody had to buy into what the design of the encounter was going to be. So when we first got together with VFX, creature art, animation, props, pretty much everybody just sat down and walked through we call them tabletops of the encounter, where either we use like a sheet of paper on a table and draw out the encounter from like a top-down perspective, use figurines. In this case, we used a whiteboard and just kind of like mapped out everything because we didn't have anything in game yet. We hadn't really built anything other than prototypes. And so it was like, hey, let's use our imagination and come up with some ideas for how this worked. And I remember, I know we've talked about it before, but one of the biggest things with this encounter was Drakkar and GW1 was frozen in the ice. And so we wanted to do something with that. And so the idea came up, I can't remember who had it, but that he could swim through the ice. And that started a lot of conversations with the art department on like how we're going to pull that off.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's from the animation team of how we're going to make him swim, and modeling. Can we actually have a physical model behind the ice, or do we need to leverage some other sort of shader trickery to create that look of him behind the ice? We ultimately ended up going with the shader trickery, which ended up being a substantial amount of work from one of our shader artists, Nick Azure. But at the end of the day, it looked convincing, and it worked really well with our tech.
And you went into the shader trickery a little bit a few weeks ago. Can you do a quick refresher on that?
Yeah, it was complicated, and there was a lot of math.
You're not wrong.
No. So we started with a base ice shader that we've used in our game throughout the game. And we took that and expanded upon it, adding elements that simulated lifelike depth and movement, but also allowed us the flexibility to control Drakkar's shadow position in the environment so that it worked with the gameplay demands that were presented to us.
Yeah, because that position is significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's the visual tell for where the most of it, where he's going to come out of and attack. So we had to leverage some flipbook technology and some flow map math and a bunch of other stuff that I don't want to bore you guys too much about. But at the end of the day, it all came together and achieved the final, or at least it achieved the idea that we all kind of had in our head from the very beginning.
Yeah, which is it's saying something because we were definitely convinced that it was so high scope that it was a high chance that we weren't going to be able to do it to the extent that we were talking about. But man, you guys really pulled out all the stops and delivered.
Yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
it took. It wasn't just one person; it was the combined
Right.
efforts of the entire VFX team across that production timeline. I mean, Nick did focus a lot on the materials, but we had Nat, another one of our VFX artists, doing all of the skill effects for Drakkar. And then I was able to, or my main primary focus was to sort of manage the delivery of what both of those artists were working on and making sure that it felt cohesive to the experience and that it played really nicely with what you guys were designing and also was hopefully inspiring for the audio team to work off of.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned making sure those two artists working, what they were working on was cohesive.
Yeah.
Were there points where those two, what they were working on, felt like they were going to clash, or did those two things come together pretty seamlessly?
No, those things come together pretty seamlessly. I mean, it's the job of any lead to make sure that you're maintaining cohesion within your team. But more importantly, the challenge wasn't the cohesion within the team because we sit right next to each other and we're
Right. Yeah.
interacting all day, every day, and brainstorming and going, oh, that looks terrible or that looks great. And we're pretty honest with each other. The challenge was maintaining that cohesion across all of the art and design, narrative, and audio departments. And so that's where early on, like week one of the development, we realized that it was vitally important that we all, like you were saying, come together and understand what design's requirements were, so that way art could express their concerns, if there was some, which there were many, and then also, more importantly, come up with alternate solutions to the presentation of the art that worked with our technology and within the design constraints.
Yeah, I remember we spent some time thinking about how we were going to build the effects for the wall transitioning and everything, and we were talking about whether or not it would be on the prop side or on the VFX side. I think it ultimately landed on you guys actually kind of doing a synthesis of the two, where you built the effects and then baked it into the prop.
Yep. Yeah. So that is a great example of how we had to work with that team, because usually the prop team would handle that sort of request, but because of the complexity of of developing the shader and then also manipulating the shader on that prop, the VFX team laid the baseline on sort of the hero props, the arena walls, and then the prop team took that foundation that we laid and applied it to all of the other areas that you see Drakkar's shadow, so the tunnels and that. But that's kind of what we do as an art team and design team. We have to work together, otherwise we're going to come up with something that doesn't look like it belongs together.
Yeah, a lot of back and forth, a lot of iteration, just as you go out throughout development, just seeing it kind of evolve over time. There's always some new challenge, some new obstacle that appears that we're like, okay, how do we solve this, right? And it's a lot of fun, honestly.
So can you guys jump into, you mentioned there were some concerns here and there. Can you guys remember points where you had a concern and you had to back off and find a different track? Without being too scary.
So I remember at one point we asked if we could do the same thing that we were going to do with the walls to the floor.
Yes. And that you would think that, okay, cool, it's just floor.
Yeah, just turn it
It's
sideways.
the same, just turn it sideways.
Yeah.
It didn't work like that because our floors are different than our walls. But we came up with another trick that uses decals that basically paints the same sort of picture on that surface that the shadow wall material did. So we achieved the same look, a cohesive look between the wall and the floor, but we used an entirely different technique to achieve that look.
Do you remember what the reason was that we ended up not being able to do the same treatment to the floor?
Oh, man. Off the top of my head, I don't. It may have been a perf thing because that shadow wall material is a costly material. We're doing a lot of, we have a lot of shader instructions in it, so it may have been partly because of that. Yeah, that's what
Oh, I remember there was an issue with alpha layer sorting where like player decals and effects, if you put it onto a material that was translucent, would disappear or also be translucent. So you guys, if we would have done that, you wouldn't have been able to see any of the telegraphs or anything that are going on.
Right.
Yeah. Did we end up doing anything for that, or is that like a consistent problem that we have?
It's a fairly consistent. It's not necessarily a problem. It's just a fairly consistent thing that we have to work within. Work
Constraint.
around. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you guys talk about decals, that's pretty much exactly what it sounds like.
Yep.
Just translated to game design.
It's
that is
like
the thing that
it's like a sticker on a surface, and it gets projected on that surface. It's a volume. It's a cube volume that, because of the way that it works, anything that is within that cube volume, doesn't matter if it's a flat surface, a terrain surface, or what it is. If that surface falls within that volume, the sticker gets projected on it. Now our decals do some weird things in some cases, where if it's a perfectly vertical surface and a perfectly horizontal surface, and they're both within that same volume, you get a little bit of texture stretching, but that's consistent with a lot of game engines, not just ours.
Yeah.
it's just how it do.
Yep.
Yeah.
But we do have, in those instances, we can prevent that stretching by flagging those vertical wall props to not accept decals. And then if we really need to have a decal on that vertical surface, we do a couple of other tricks with our decal volumes that allow us to project them on that wall. But they're sort of secret sauce tricks.
Yeah, and I remember as well the challenge of having the walls have to be flagged to not accept any decals meant that we had to think about how to display his shadow a little differently, and that's what ended up leading us to baking it into the prop, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Something else that you mentioned, you were talking about how there's a lot going on there, and you had mentioned a little bit when we talked before about the challenges of how you had all of these stacking elements and all of this stuff going on.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to go into that a little bit more?
So, like, when you have a lot of things on screen, that everything that you have on screen impacts performance. And so one of the terms that we use to describe that stacking of elements on screen is overdraw. And overdraw is basically, at a high level, the idea that multiple objects are writing to the same pixel or the same group of pixels. So for example, if you have a window and you are looking through that window and you have objects outside of that window, the pixels that are being used to render that are rendering the window. They're the transparency of that window. They're rendering the objects. And so you have two items, right? They're drawing to the same pixel. And the more objects or elements that you have drawing to those pixels, the more that begins to impact your frame rate and performance. And so with an encounter like this, there's a lot of stuff going on, and we had to be really careful about when and where we use the big visual spectacle effects. So those big impact moments where you slam in the ground and just sending ice everywhere, and use those sparingly enough that it didn't impact performance, but then we also augmented it with other smaller area of effects that continue to fill out the scene in a nice way.
Yeah, we had to be we had to try and stay conservative because player effects going on, especially whenever you have so many people in the open world, it's easy to forget about how much of those are in the scene whenever you're developing it in a vacuum and you're kind of doing it on the test servers. Which meant that, like, for this encounter specifically, we tried to get as many as people possible playing this as much as we could throughout development, just so that we didn't fall into that trap of making something that looks really, really good when you look at it from a 1 to 5 person perspective, but then gets lost in the readability whenever you have just a massive group of people attacking the creature.
Yeah, you guys were playtesting frequently, weren't you?
Yeah, I think once every week towards the end, and once every 2 weeks throughout development. Yeah. It gave us a chance to all get together and sync up because all of the different departments were kind of working in tandem with each other on their various aspects of the creature. And when you've got this release going on alongside all of the other stuff that we're doing. It's tough to stay on the course, I guess.
Yeah, you've got that. Listen, I know you've got this thing coming up, but we really need you to come and help with this.
Yeah. And specifically, like, the rest of the episode also needs a bunch of effects and everything. So people get scattered and are working on different parts of the episode at a time. So it's important to get everybody together and communicate as often as possible.
Yeah, and those playtests, I mean, you were bringing multiple teams working on that in there, so everybody got to see their stuff in context and how it lined up with what everybody else was working on. Did you find that, how helpful was that, getting everything in there? Did it help affect some changes that would have not been seen otherwise?
I think so.
Yeah.
I definitely think it allowed us to really get a feel of how well the implementation of everything together was actually visualizing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and through those playtests, early on we had the conversation on the creature side. Do we need to model the entire Drakkar model from head to tail in full high-res detail, or do we model just the front half and don't have a back half, or what does that look like?
God, that's horrifying to think about.
Yeah, and it was through these repeated playtests and meetings with the entire teams that the art teams and design that we realized, well, you'll never really see the back half of Drakkar in the encounter. He's always either sticking out of a wall or he's swimming behind the walls. And we almost made the call not to do the back half at all because we weren't going to see it. But luckily, Kate, our VFX lead, was very passionate about at least having the back half, but maybe less detail. And that actually saved our team, the VFX team, in the long run when we created that shadow. Because if we had gone the route of just modeling the part that you'd seen and not had anything else, the shadow we wouldn't have been able to create the shadow on the wall the way that we did. Since she modeled the entire thing, we're able to use a depth rendering process and have a very simple animation of Drakkar just swimming around. And we had his full body at this point, so we can capture that and then convert that into a flipbook, and that's what made it look like it's like he was swimming. And so having that, his tail there and the front half, at the end of the day, saved us a lot of headache on the shadow side.
Yeah,
That would have been a different kind of horror.
It would have been a different kind of horror for
Seriously,
sure.
yikes.
Yeah, without it, you guys would have had to come up with what the back half of his model looked like,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So-
for sure. I mean, luckily we had concept art that described what his overall shape looked like, but we would have had to somehow fill in that negative space if it wasn't there with something else.
Yeah.
I maintained from last time it would have just been a horrifying puppet on a stick. And Jormag's just back there.
Yeah, exactly.
It early on in development, because we needed to make sure that we were really starting to visualize the encounter from as early on as possible. Creature Team actually gave us a really, really early model that did very much look like a puppet because it was just like huge and bulky. There were no details. It was all blue and everything, and it was just hilarious.
Okay, I want to see that at some point.
Yeah,
So
I think we actually have some behind-the-scenes pictures from one of our last.
yeah, I want
Yeah.
to peek at those here in a little bit. But talking about Drakkar swimming around and moving around reminded me that I want to talk about some of the audio stuff because attaching Drakkar's audio to the movement was a cool thing that I wanted to make sure we touched on.
Yeah, it was a cool thing.
Because I'm sorry, I didn't mean to traumatize you.
No,
but
no,
I was
no, no.
actually very impressed.
Again, there was the whole creation of the gutturals, we call them, for Drakkar,
Yeah.
all the creature sounds, and then we knew we wanted the ice swimming sound, and Andy Martin was a vendor we worked with who's a sound designer, and he actually created all the sounds. But then Keenan got them back and he implemented them into the build so that we could actually hear them. And when we went to hook up the specific ice swimming sound, we realized that the sound was playing from the shadows swimming around the room, and the sound was playing from the center of the room because there was nothing to attach the audio emitter to. So he had to go, I'm not sure who it was, but he had to go talk to somebody in design and get a bone, we call them a bone offset, added to the shadow so the sound would actually move, and that was super important because players need to hear and telegraph where it is. It was a cool sound on its own, but it doesn't enhance or support gameplay if it just sits in the center of the room and plays. And there was a hot second where like, well, we just fake it and kind of have it fly around the room real quick and you can't tell. But Keenan's very smart and collaborative, and he went and got it figured out. And the recordings for that was a combination of the gutturals Andy made, but also Andy and I had done some recordings back in like 2017 at Lake Diablo, and he had those sitting on it. Oh, there's some pictures
Hey.
that I took on my Instagram, but it was very cold, and we suffered. But we got some great sounds, and they got used. They got used for Drakkar swimming through the ice. So that was cool.
So what were the sounds? How did you capture them while you were out there freezing to death?
Andy stood on a log, like a really 30, 40-foot log that was half submerged in water, and it was all semi-frozen. And he had a boom microphone that he was holding like this for hours. And I was sitting on a dock throwing rocks at him. And this was
at Andy?
Well, because he's holding the microphone. It's pointing at, let's say, the desk is the thing, and so if anybody hasn't heard this, if you look up, throw YouTube, rock on ice, pew 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 pew. So we were gathering rocks and I was throwing them, and we were trying to. It was weird because we were trying to go when the lake was not completely frozen over, because if you throw something on it, then it just goes conk, it doesn't do anything, but it was slightly melted. So I was throwing rocks at him on the loose ice to try and get all this movement. And we did that for several hours, and then went home. Yeah.
So you've had that waiting since 2017.
Yeah, I mean, we're sound people. We're always gathering interesting things, and that's cool. And then you record it and you put it on a shelf, and then someday you see, this cool ice dragon, and you're like, I got a sound for that. Because when we're in development, there's not always time to say, let's blue sky what sound this should be and let's go record it. It's like, well, we don't have a lot of time, so what have we already recorded? And so it's kind of like you just kind of being diligent when you have free time and just recording whatever you can. And a lot of that goes into the planning of the release, where it's like, it's going to be a lot of ice and ice caves. And it's like, okay, audio team, let's record icy things. And build our backlog of our library. Yeah,
and even beyond the encounter itself, it helps with the ambience of the arena and the place that he's in too, because you can hear kind of like that sound of like ice cracking around you, the glacier moving.
Oh, somebody was playing with their headphones on.
Always do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about some of the other audio work that you did that we are not going to have people listen to because we like you guys?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Nobody should have to hear that in the raw.
Well, when we talked about Drakkar, I keep wanting to say Drakkar because I think the text-to-speech always
Drakkar.
said... Yeah, Drakkar.
It's fantastic.
So Drakkar just had this wicked look when it popped out of the ice, and it just, to me, seemed like it should scream and be really sharp and just cut through the mix of everything else happening. And I kept thinking of the Nazgul from the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, and I knew that they had done some wine glass scraping. And so we knew we were going to outsource the creation of these sound effects, but we basically recorded some source to hand to Andy Martin and say, if you can use this, great. If not, use it for reference is kind of what we want. Which was actually one of my favorite moments. Was I went to a store up here and purchased a bunch of wine glasses, and I got one champagne glass. And the person at the
checkout.
Thank you, brain.
We were tired.
They were like, just one champagne glass, and I was like, the brain cycles of explaining why I'm only buying. Well, I was in my brain. I was like, I'm gonna destroy this in about 24 hours, but I'm not gonna. There's a lot of audio
Long
purchase.
Story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was like, yes. Sometimes just yes.
And there's a whole monologue in your head, and just what comes out is yes.
Yeah. So Joseph Clark, one of our other senior sound designers here, is excellent at performing the sound. And what I mean by that is, so we took the glass and we scraped it on metal. it's the reason we're not playing that, because it is like the worst sound in the world. I sent it to Ruby and I put in like big bold letters 3 times, turn down your headphones because it'll take your head off.
In red font.
In red font, yeah.
And, yes, it was an alarming email,
Yeah.
but I appreciated it so much.
I call it mustard text. It's red font, yellow highlight, bold.
Yeah, and I appreciated it. Nobody should ever have to hear it again.
But so you can record that just going rank, rank. But Joe gets in there and he was scraping this, and it was, and he would get these crazy gestures. And so we sent that to Andy Martin, and he didn't end up using the sounds for whatever reason, probably for the obvious ones. It's terrible to listen to. but he was like, oh, this is so cool. I know what you guys want. I know what the gesture is of the sounds.
It's a baseline for what it felt like.
Yeah, it already feels like a thing, a living thing, and so now it's just up to the sound designer to kind of realize that a little more and flesh it out. So yeah, glass, we'll use it for something. It's in our library, but it got used only as reference for this. And Andy did a great job. What he sent us back, we iterated on that and then plugged it in and tested it. So that was the sound effects side of it. And then there's the whole music side, which I don't know if we want to come back to that or...
Go for it, because I really like that story.
Okay. So that's the sound effects. Stan is amazing. Yeah. So early on, we were also scoping what we want to do for the music for this. And I think I had just penciled in like 3 combat loops, intro, middle, and the ending, where it's really high intensity. And we worked with Stan Lepard for this track, who has worked with us quite a bit. He's a great composer. And composers want to know, well, why are there 3 phases? What's happening? What's justifying that? And I was like, well, there's the intro, and then there's the second phase where Drakkar is kind of sneaky shadow, and then Drakkar comes out. So, and then there's the burn down at the end where you just last 25% health. And so we're like, okay, well, there's 4 stages. And at some point in development, somebody had talked about Drakkar popping through the ice, through the floor, and they kept calling it this Jaws moment. I don't know if it was somebody in design, or I think James Richter was saying it, one of the producers. And that just stuck with me as like, well, Jaws is scary because it's that like you can't see what's happening and it's really uncomfortable. So it was cool about Stan, a couple things, many things, but I'm going to highlight a couple things. He's done a lot of work, to my knowledge, with like kind of procedural generated and textural music. So he started sending us all these really wacky textures, which we were playing in the intro. And it just had this super uncomfortable vibe. And then when Drakkar would pop out of the ice, we play what's called a stinger, which is the orchestra going, blah, ba-da-da-da, da-da-da, whatever, something. And that covers up the transition, which is happening from that noodly stuff to something that's a little more combat oriented, which has drums, ticka 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 da, and so.
Because that transition's kind of rough.
Well, yeah. So transitioning music requires it requires the game engine to be musically literate, and what I mean by that is it knows where the beat is. If I'm conducting in 4/4, down is always the 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and it needs to know where those beats happen so that it can look at the music that's playing and say, we're going to transition in a musical place. We can't do that just because our tools don't support it. And the other thing that's really cool about Stan is he's very creative, he's a great problem solver, and so he looks at those limitations and he figured out, well, we can go from a combat piece that has a beat, boots and cats and boots and cats, and we can get to another piece of music, but it has to not have a tempo. So it goes to something that doesn't have drums. If we try to transition from one piece of music that has a beat to another piece of music that has a beat, it usually happens very unmusically, or we leverage the stinger to just try and it's basically playing something that's louder than the transitioning that's happening, so you can't hear the transition, and it sounds better than if it wasn't there. So a lot of creative problem solving, a lot of planning of emotionally how should the music make you feel, but also technically how are we going to implement it, because we could hire a composer and say, go write great music, but if we don't know how we're going to plug it in, it's basically useless. So having the blueprint all planned out before we even commission a note of music has been super helpful, and I think helped us ship some more adaptive music experiences that hopefully heighten the emotion. Because we were in development on that music, and we were like, is this working? Is it weird? Is it? And then we got in a play test with a few of the designers, and somebody was like, oh my God, the music feels great. And I was like, yes, it worked. So Stan did really great writing that music and sort of designing the implementation scheme and the emotion of it, and then that was all handed off to Keenan, and he implemented it all. And I would just come into the room and say, like, this is amazing. You are all great.
Yeah, and this saga so far has been has had a lot of like really musically intensive in terms of implementation moments. Like we had the big concert in the prologue, and then for this fight, we needed to have dynamic sounding music that didn't sound too dissonant whenever it transitioned. So I'm sure that's a valuable set of lessons and obstacles to overcome, especially for the future.
Yes. We love music. We love what it brings to the experience, and it's always a joy, problem solving the creative implementation schemes. And truly, it usually is fun to figure out how are we gonna do this. So, yeah.
It's funny you said that. I spent the long weekend playing around in Grothmar, catching up on achievements, and ran through the concert I don't know how many times.
It's so fun.
And trying to get my bouncer achievements. So I was like, oh yeah, that's been on my mind anyway. And all I can hear is Joe now.
Yeah, Joe Clark and Keenan and Novera, everybody involved with that whole experience. It's so amazing. It's such a testament to the talent and the passion here. That was another one where I feel like I was just standing back and saying, like, you are all amazing. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, but Drakkar. So don't distract me with Metal Legion because it's way too much fun too. So back to all of these teams working together, because you guys all did work extremely, extremely well. Bringing all of the teams in super early, getting the syncs and the tests in there. Once you ramped up to once a week for playtesting and everybody syncing in together, how well did you feel like you had pretty much ironed everything out pretty well? Or were you still running into dissonance here and there and feeling like different teams needed to pull things back and change things as you kept playtesting?
Honestly, I feel like it coalesced pretty well.
Yeah, I think the only thing that really was still the question at that time was, is this shadow tech going to work? And if not, what's our acceptable backup plan? But yeah, by that point, all of the teams knew what they were doing and how, and more importantly, how what they were doing connected to what all the other teams were doing.
Yeah. It allowed us to really focus in on the polish of the timing of the effects and, when things happen, how things transition away from each other. We came up with some creative solutions for just using some color shifting to get more out of the, like when he puts his hands to the ground and he's pulling up the spirit of the wild energy. We were able to kind of tackle those polish tasks a lot without the stress of knowing that there was a bunch of other things that needed to be done because of the amount of playtesting beforehand.
Speaking of different skills and Drakkar putting down, you had talked some about creating a consistent language and of telegraphing for players to try to help them understand.
Yeah, so early on, we knew that especially for this saga, we wanted to start using mechanics in the open world that were usually reserved for like dungeon encounters or raid encounters, fractals, because like that's where people are going to be more comfortable, kind of like practicing things, and it's not necessarily failure if you yourself don't do the mechanic correctly, because you have all of your friends that are out in the open world that'll help you. And so early on in the saga, we had the ice giant, and he has this attack where he slams his fist down and it creates this shockwave that goes out, and you jump over the shockwave in order to avoid it. And we knew that that's a cool mechanic. It requires you to actually like be moving around, to be aware of where it's coming from and watch your surroundings. And we knew that we wanted to reuse it for Drakkar. So mechanically, we try to ramp it up a little bit so that you see it happen in the strike mission first, and it slams down. You've got 1, and that's just kind of your introduction to it. And then in the Ox Shrine, you see it happen whenever the orbs like come down and they hit the ground. And now there's more of them that are going off, but they have like kind of a cadence to them. There's really still only 1 at a time. And then in Drakkar, it's like he's slamming down 1, slamming down another. The first thing he does is he slams down 2, so like you have to jump over kind of both of them at the same time. And keeping that language consistent while still allowing for the effect to evolve, it was really important to us so that we could teach our players better how to play the game and not create kind of fake out mechanics where it's like I've seen that before, but it did something different. We actually ended up doing that a lot with some of the effects for Drakkar, didn't we?
Yeah. So it's sort of like a win-win scenario, right? We anytime we're given a scenario like this, make the Drakkar encounter, there's dozens and dozens of initial requests, and we have to vet all of those requests against the time that we have to do the production. And not everything makes it through that vetting process. And so in this case, we knew, okay, cool, Drakkar is still a Jormeg champion. And the Ice Giant from Prologue and then in Episode 1 that expands is part of that Jormeg army. So he's using Jormeg effects. And so it made sense that for Drakkar, you would also use some Jormeg-influenced effects. And we knew that the Shadow Wall was going to be a massive time suck. And we knew that there was a couple other hero skill moments that were also going to be time sucks. And so not every skill request could we make a one-off hero effect for. And so we have to be smart and reuse mechanics like you're talking about, but also effects and animation and creatures in the appropriate ways that maintain continuity and reinforce the gameplay stuff that you're talking about. And so we had just a small handful of reusable effects from the Ice Golem that we used as a baseline, and then made a couple of small tweaks to just give it a little bit extra Drakkar flavor. And then that saved us probably 3 or 4 days just on those AoE skill effects.
Yeah, and we were really we were able to get those in early on. Whereas, like, sometimes the designer puts in a very prototype version of a skill that uses really prototype effects to make sure that we know that, hey, this isn't final. And sometimes when we do that, the mechanics need to kind of evolve when the effects get involved with it. But because we were building off of an existing thing that we had shipped before, it was very easy to just be like, okay, and this skill goes here, and it goes here, and then that's it. We're done. We can focus on other things now.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly like what you were talking about with your audio library. You know, we began over the course of this saga, build a library of assets that can be reused in similar and different ways. And so the theme for this saga obviously is ice and snow. Spoiler alert. And so we knew going in that we have a whole bunch of stuff that we have to make, and we're going to also have a whole library of stuff that we can reuse, so that way we can focus the majority of our time on the really spectacle, awesome moments, and not have to do these small little
coverage.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a spice rack.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Not my term. Damien Castbauer. TM.
Aw, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll take it. That sounds like a good Damien thing too. Yeah. But yeah, to have that backlog of assets, like you have the backlog of sounds, to not waste time going out and, okay, we're going to get this new thing just for the sake of saying that we did a new thing.
Yeah.
So you can focus your time on the content.
And I don't know that I would see it as a waste of time, like, because we would love to, like, if we lived in a world where everything was this artisanal, crafted thing, like, that would be awesome.
In a
but
world
it's just
where you
like
had infinite time and resources.
Yeah, of course. But you know, other than that, like you said, we're scoping and triaging, and how can we leverage things as efficiently as possible, but still make it great and meaningful. Do you
guys want 5 seconds to think about the world of infinite time and resources?
No.
Chris just starts to cry.
That'll just make us sad.
Cameron's off in a very happy world. So, after we got Drakkar shipped, he's out there, he's stomping everything. You got the chance to, well, not all by yourself, but the team got the chance to work on an update.
Yes.
And do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
that was fun.
Yeah. So we knew that balancing a world boss for the open world is very, very difficult to get fine-tuned with the internal playtests that we have. Because everybody plays the game differently, and so damage output is different depending on what class you're playing, what elite spec you're playing, how you're playing it, what kind of role you're doing, and so we wanted to ship this guy with tools in place to be able to watch the data of how players were going in, what the participation rate was, what the average encounter length was, what the success rate was, and then use all of that data to then fine-tune him on live to try and really dial in on the right experience that we wanted. And so across the board, we made some changes just to like normal balance things like his health and his break bar a little bit. But in addition to that, Connor Fallon and I talked a bit about, hey, we've got some of these mechanics that we have that aren't really punishing the player for failing the mechanic too much. And we started to think about like what are some easy ways that we can, within a really quick time span, create incentives for doing the mechanic correctly, without having to create an entirely new encounter with a new mechanic and have players go in and have to relearn an entire fight that they've been doing for 2 weeks.
Yeah, surprised everything's different now.
Yeah, which, you know, it's a little difficult because you have to be very cognizant of what changes you're making. And so we added in a couple of extra mechanics for when Javi's like in her shield. If you're not inside the shield for a short period of time before going out into the area where all the ads are spawning, you'll actually start taking damage from the snowstorm. And in addition to that, we also added in the failure mechanic, where a lot of people were saying, you know, hey, something cool could happen when the group fails, so that it doesn't feel like, you know, like such a complete failure, right? And so we're like, how do we make failure fun? And Connor looked at me and was just like, what if?
Connor's over there like stroking his evil cat.
Immediately I was almost like, no. But he's like, what if players were all turned hostile to each other? Because it's Drakkar. And
it's
like
Jormag.
and it's Jormag's whispers, and Drakkar is the mouthpiece of Jormag. So the true strength of what Jormag can impose upon you should be present here, right? And so immediate reaction was like, whoa, no, that's crazy town. And he's like, is it though? And we went back and forth for a little bit. And eventually he whipped up something that I think is both really thematically interesting without feeling like super uber punishing, because when you go down, you come back to your senses and you're no longer hostile to players. And so it's a bit of this like kind of narrative moment where Drakkar has now turned everybody rageful against each other. And it creates a fun little moment where you get to do something you don't ever really get to do in the open world, which is try and survive the mass of players that are all hitting each other.
And from a design point of view, there was it seems like there was a lot to think about, like, okay, so how far does this extend? How long does it last? And because some of the concerns when it was first discovered, because I know, like, as soon as Connor told me, I'm just like logged into the game and I'm just waiting for somebody to find out. And Connor and I were like messaging back and forth that first day. I was like, nobody's found out yet. nobody's failed it yet. Connor, do something. And he's like, I'm watching too, man. I can't make this go any faster. But as soon as players found out, there was concern, like, okay, is this like map wide? Is this forever? What if I don't want this? And those concerns, I mean, I know you guys thought of that ahead of time.
Absolutely. One of the pillars of Guild Wars 2 is you're always happy to see another player. And so at first, this seems like it goes way against that.
Yeah.
But we also are trying new ways of telling the narratives that we have. And so we put on some restrictions. If you leave the fight area before failure, you're not going to get turned. If you leave it even after the fight has failed, as long as you're not in combat, then you can go back to a friendly team. We put in a lot of fail-safes to make sure that people couldn't grief each other. This was just supposed to be a fun little thing. You can down your friends. You can be like, yeah! And then, get all your rage out from failing the event, and then come back and try it again, and, hopefully succeed. It's definitely something that is a balancing act. Because there was a version of this where we just allowed you to be hostile to everybody until you were killed.
Wow.
And we didn't end up actually putting that into the game because we were immediately like, no. People are gonna go to the town and they'll start killing all the NPCs or kill all the other players that are just warping into the map. So yeah, we definitely have to stay aware that we want it to be an enjoyable experience and not a grieving.
Sudden mental image of just waypointing into Jorah's Keep and being immediately murdered is exactly what that would be like. So thank you for not. I appreciate it. So, well, do you guys want to look at some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that you brought?
Sure.
Okay, and then if you all have questions, we will answer a couple of those there at the end.
Sounds
all right,
good.
The remote control is all yours.
Let's see. On.
It's on.
Yes.
Oh, baby salamander Drakkar.
Yes, this is the product of not having conceptual art time.
All right, that's fair.
All of our teams on every given release, they have budgets and schedules and availability. And for this encounter, we had a challenging skill, the channel, the Spirit of the Wild channeling skill. And the concept team, unfortunately, was busy. They were fully booked. And so being the lead VFX artist, I had to take it upon myself to try to. I was failing at verbally communicating the idea that I wanted my team to execute on, and so I had to take some MS Paint drawing lessons and come up with this to visually describe what we were trying to describe with words.
I finally figured out, I just happened to glance over the preview monitor while Cameron was talking earlier, and I finally figured out what it reminds me of. His head looks like one of those old Christmas light bulbs.
Ha! It totally does.
That's what it's been on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, and this is actually a paint over from in-game. We took a screenshot of him in that channeling pose, and then just painted right on top of that.
I'm not kidding. I want it as my phone background.
All right. Well, we will email it to you after this.
Thank you.
So this is early, very, very early prototype testing for the shadow material. We knew that we wanted this material to have flipbook support so that we can control how the shadow moved and the directions that it faced. And so this is our very early test using, like I said at the beginning, that this is our standard ice material, and we're injecting that flipbook logic to it. We're injecting layers of parallax and depth to simulate that this thing is actually behind the ice, not rendering on the surface of the ice. And then also giving us the controllability that we needed from design's perspective for gameplay. And we just, to prototype this material, we grab assets that already exist in game. And we do that because we don't want to create new stuff until we know that the material is going to work. And so we had this flipbook of one of the scarabs, and we used that as our shadow stand-in. And that stayed in the encounter for a number of weeks until we finally got the shadow tech to work just right, which was really awesome. This is the next evolution of the shadow. And this is us going, cool, we now have the depth and the parallax working really nicely. Now let's start making it look like Drakkar's shadow. And so this is testing the flipbook logic and the ability to move from one state to the next. And we did that with simple spheres. And it needed to animate, so we just squashed and stretched a sphere. And that was, that's the next evolution from that previous image that we saw. And then that leads into, this is the first realization of the entire shadow shader coming together with the flipbooks, the rough Drakkar model. Like, this is the first moment where all of the art teams and the design teams narrative, we can go, holy cow, this is actually going to work.
That was good.
The 5 weeks of effort that this has been to this point is paying off.
That was such a cool moment too when that came online. I
Yeah.
remember I was in a few of the play tests. And it was just such a big win.
And you can
that
see
y'all
the
pulled this
flipbook
off.
control here that we have. He's facing one direction when he's sticking out of the wall, and then he backs up, turns to the right, and swims to the right, and then turns again and faces to come out. And that's all done with 64 frames of flipbook animation.
That had to have felt like such a huge victory after all of the work that went into it. That
Yeah.
we've just been looking at a tiny little slice of that.
Yeah, it was. I was super proud of the entire team, the VFX team, and the greater art and design teams, because this was the one feature of the entire Drakkar experience from the very beginning that I was very concerned about, and I knew it'd be an exciting moment and something that really stood out in our saga, but it was certainly a concern from the perspective of how can we pull this off? Will we be able to pull this off?
Right.
And if we don't, what's our backup plan?
Yeah.
But we work through these iterative steps. We don't just start making that final asset that you saw from the very beginning.
Right.
We do these steps. We go through the evolution, and that allows us the opportunity to pivot early if we need to.
Right. It's such a good look at everything that goes into what seems like a simple little moment.
Yeah, yeah, and on from the player's perspective, it is a simple 20-minute encounter, but from the developer's perspective, this is like 4 months worth of development time.
A lot of development time.
Yes.
I still remember the first time that I saw that in game. I like freaked out, grabbed everybody around me. It was like, look what they did!
Yeah, yeah. This is early skill testing of the smash or the stomp skills that you're talking about, where we started with just this decal on the ground, and we're like, wait, we can just reuse some of the ice golem effects here to really enhance this. And so that was that. This is just another view of it as well. We'll kind of go through some of these fast. This is the now you're seeing the culmination of like this looks really awesome, and it didn't really cost us that much to put in the game because this is an asset that we already had. And it visually matches Drakkar and Jormeg and the theme of this episode in the saga, so why not leverage it? That way we can put our time into the more questionable assets like this shadow wall.
Not questionable.
Yeah.
High profile, high impact.
Yeah,
high
exactly.
maintenance. Oh yeah.
This so that concept art, the piece of concept art that we saw at the very beginning, this is what we had before we came up with that piece of art. This is the very first appearance of him channeling that spirit of the wild energy, and I love this image particularly because it looks like a troll doll hair, right?
I can't unsee the troll hair. Ever since the first time you said that to me, I'm like, yep, there it is.
Yeah, and this is also another good example of like our overdraw challenge. There's a lot of effects going on here. You see smoke just in the environment. You see those tornadoes. You see the red troll hair on Drakkar. All these things are occupying the same pixel space, and this is where we have to be really cognizant of how much visual effects and creatures and all the things that are being displayed in the environment, so that we don't kill performance and everybody's frame rate drops down to like 10.
Yes.
And then it evolved into the final implementation that you see here. It's a little more refined. There's less of the troll hair going on. And you see that channel, the energy being channeled from the lake, the frozen lake bed now at this point. It's starting at his hands and it's moving up his arm and culminating to around where the player can see, which is, at this point is the head. And so we had to have the big visual tell be on the areas where the player's interacting with. So it's the head and the feet. And then, this is an example of we had a white dragon in a white and blue room with a lot of white and blue effects. So how do we make our effects stand out in an environment of sameness?
Where everything is blue.
Yeah, exactly. And so the creature team identified very early on that what has happened between Drakkar and Guild Wars 1 and 2, he's kind of decayed over the years. He's been asleep, but slowly decaying. And so we took that idea and ran with it in some of his visual effects. And that's where we get this really viscous goo, like rotting, decaying flesh, sort of like just grossness. And that helps our visual effects stand out against the environment and the creature model. And also it's just kind of like hooky, and it's fun.
Yeah.
That's disgusting to think about. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that.
it's
Yeah.
what we do. We like to, have fun with disgusting things from time to time.
Now it's coming directly at the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can see we really liked his goo, so we showed a lot.
I hate that sentence.
This is, again, very early. What does the channeling look like? We still have the troll hair here, but we're now starting to put that visual tell on the arms, again, because this is where the players are interact with the most on this guy. And the last thing we wanted to have happen was have players miss the visual tell and have that screw with gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that actually, that effect ended up inspiring another attack where that looks like a bad place to stand. So we ended up turning that into a damage field. So if you're standing on his feet, you're actually taking ticks of damage from that energy.
Yeah.
Okay, when I'm playing the Drakkar encounter, I'm usually throwing heals. Stop standing there. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, exactly. And then
you guys
here you
are
can
stressing me out.
You kind of see the final implementation here of the effects on the ground and how they transition from the surface of the lake up his arm and up through his body. Mm-hmm. Lots of tricks going on here, from decals and particles and mesh effects. Nat was the primary visual effects artist for Drakkar's skills, and having a singular artist sort of focus on all of his skills allows us a strong continuity between all of his skills. And Nat just really did an amazing job with the treatment of Drakkar. Mm-hmm. It made my job easy, which was just like, hey, like that looks cool. Let's ship with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks fantastic.
And this is another great example of the overdraw that we're talking about. It looks simple, like there's a bunch of smoke and stuff, but all that smoke is drawing on top of each other. And this is our first chance of seeing what it looks like when Drakkar sucks back into the ice. We wanted a really we wanted that ice to feel alive and magical, but we didn't want it to feel totally like just a wet water puddle. Mm-hmm. And so we played a little bit with what sort of textural elements go into supporting that. So you do get a little bit of that surface water tension distortion feel mixed with more physical elements of the snow, smoke, and bits of ice and those things that all come together to create a cohesive effect that looks like he's just sucking back into the ice. Mm-hmm. It's just another view of it.
It turned out so well.
Yeah, this whole encounter. I like this shot because this reminds me of like the Kool-Aid Man. From like the 90s.
Yeah. I can't unhear it.
Yep. Yeah. And actually, Nat has a funny little GIF that we shared around internally of basically ripping.
I saw that.
Yeah, ripping off some audio and putting that in and timed it perfectly. It's really funny.
Amazing.
This is the shadow that you were talking about that's on the ground. It looks visually the same as the wall, but we're using different technology here to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it ended up working really well as it starts very subtle. Yeah. And then it gradually becomes more apparent that this area is not where you want to stand, which is exactly what we wanted, because we didn't want it to be too overwhelming and too like, here's a red ring.
Right.
And I think it really hits that mark.
Yeah, anytime that we can use the environment or the skill effects to indicate the size of the area of effect versus just the red ring, the more that makes me happy. And hopefully the player's happy, because we're coming up with creative, artistic solutions for gameplay mechanics. It'd be kind of a boring game if all it was red rings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, the pings and the growing shadow it's not just, okay, here's a red ring, here's where you go. But it's that growing stress. It's that Jaws, something's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally.
I don't know what it is, but I know I need to run.
And we actually ended up getting rid of the pulsing rings after looking at this effect and just being like, you know what? I think the shadow is enough. And
It's scary enough.
Yeah, it increases the tension because it's less likely that you'll notice it unless you're sitting right on top of it.
Yeah, and that's a nice win also, because one of our challenges is balancing visual noise and things that are on the ground, like that warning ring on top of the shadow, contribute to visual noise, especially when you have 80 players in a space and they're all firing off player skills, and then you have enemies that are in that same space doing skills as well. It gets really noisy really quick, and so getting to the point where the shadow described the area of effect to well enough that we didn't need that red ring just cleaned up the visual nicely.
Oh man,
Oh my gosh.
this was good.
Yeah.
This tiny little player.
And this is another good example of effective reuse. That burst coming up out of the ground, that came from the foundation of the ice golem. The ice golem burst up out of the ground, and we took that and we used that as a base. We tweaked it a bit, added some Drakkar elements to it, just so that it wasn't exactly the same. And something that initially took us 4 or 5 days to make for the ice golem. In this case, it took us a couple of hours.
Oh, wow.
Can I say that previous one was one of my favorite animations because in the animation editor you didn't see the bubble, and the lower half of his body wasn't animated, so we always thought it was him sitting driving a car because his hands were on the bubble and his legs were just out.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun
man.
with that.
Well, that's what it is forever now.
Whoa, that's a lot of snow.
Oh.
A lot of snow. That was the theme of this episode.
That was actually
Yikes.
that environment zone was what we had before we ended up shipping.
That is so bright.
It is incredibly bright, and so this is an example of we dialed that back a lot.
Thank you.
To try and pull back the visual noise, because while it looks really like you're in a blizzard, which always has low visibility, it really did make the gameplay a bit more difficult to read.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little.
Yeah, so luckily it's not like this anymore.
Yes.
So a lot of this is just different views of the same stuff that we've seen, but it showcases the detail that we put into this and the things that we have to consider when we're creating these for the design team.
Yeah. And hey, that last GIF actually it's a bug, but it showcases what you were talking about earlier.
With the decal.
Yeah.
Yep.
Where it's actually just a volume, and since he's in the volume,
Yeah,
he's getting the
since
decal
Drakkar
drawn.
is a mesh that can be rendered upon, you see blue stretching on half of him, and that's the size of the decal volume. It's drawing on the floor. You see that sort of suck away, but because he's inside of that volume,
It's
it's
coming with
also
him
drawing
when
on top
he-
of him. So we have to have the prop artist and the map artist go and flag Drakkar did not accept decals, because that doesn't look good.
No.
It's not great, but these are good looks at some of the things that you have to catch ahead of time. Like,
This is
Blizzard-
why playtesting is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like that Blizzard wasn't great, but it's good that we caught that beforehand, and we're like, hey, here's a not white screen for everybody.
And then you guys, if you played the encounter, you've seen this. This is the
Javi's incredibly angry.
Yep. Got to melt that wall to get your car. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty much what we got.
I love, by the way, in that encounter, she does that, and she's just like taking everything out of her, and she was like, see, it's fine. It's easy.
Yeah.
This is great. Ugh.
They really got such a great read for her. We in the audio hall, we were playing that. We were like, oh my goodness! Like, we all our views great, but like she had the mood and the energy. It was such a great read.
It was Deborah, right?
I don't know.
I was about
Wilson?
to ask.
I know.
Like,
I know
can't
it's.
remember.
I know it's Ashley Williams from Mass Effect. That's what I know. It's the same. I don't know her name.
Yeah, she really brought a lot to this
Yeah.
performance, or a lot of her performance brought a lot to the encounter.
All right. Do you guys want to answer some questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Are there plans to have more world bosses like Drakkar in the future? So, not any solid plans right now. I mean, world bosses are really fun, and so they're always something that we're considering. I think based on how popular Drakkar is, we can consider that for the future as well.
Was there any tech developed for this episode we're excited to utilize further in the future? Yes, the shadow material. The underlying tech that we developed for that can be used in a whole bunch of other ways, not just for shadows behind ice walls. Because at the primary core, what we did is we created a shader that allows us finite control over flipbook animations and their position and speed within the flipbook. So we're going to be using this tech a lot more throughout the rest of the saga in vastly different ways than shadows on icy walls.
Yeah, that's one of the cool things about when you guys put all of that work into something like that is all of the ways it can be reutilized in the future.
Yeah. Yep. You would think that it's only going to be used for ice, but we've got some big plans for it in the future.
No.
Yeah.
Quick, talk about something else. Because
How did you come up, pardon my reading level, come up with the musical theme of Drakkar? It is really great. Well, the short answer is we threw a lot of money at someone very talented who's been a great collaborator, and they're great. But the better answer to that is around the episode, the Metal Bound by Blood. What was the episode name? The prologue?
Yeah, Bound by Blood.
I sat with narrative and said, like, where are we going for the saga? And we outlined the major beats and Jormag. Somebody keep an eye on me if I think we can talk about Jormag.
yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't know. I don't get. in
Hey,
front of the camera.
everybody, Jormag is a thing.
Oh,
there you
great.
go.
So we knew Jormag was a thing, and when we actually did the announcement trailer for the saga, that was we spent the time with Stan and said we need a theme for Jormag. It needs to be manipulative and all these things, and he wrote something. And so Drakkar, because they are the amplifier for the voice of Jormag, it wanted to be related to that. So again, Stan worked his creative juices and melded the structures of Jormag's theme, which is kind of complex and kind of tone clusters and all these things, and then mesh that with the function of the situation, which is combat music, which mostly means big drums. As far as the design of that, Bangar, our villain right now, he's very. If you listen, the themes are designed with a lot of intent, and his is very simple. It's very percussive and warrior-oriented, and Jormag's, we kept saying, was very cerebral because Jormag uses magic to influence people. So it's very musically, it's much more complex, and so Drakkar's music leans into that complexity, if you will, from a harmonic point of view. Money and a lot of planning is how we came up with that.
It's a good answer. I like it.
Yeah.
Will Drakkar continue to receive balance updates as the saga progresses? So one of the things that we did with this guy is we are using some new tools to be able to balance him, adjust his balance a little bit on the fly as we get in more data. So if things start to see, or if we start to see that things are getting like crazy hard or crazy easy, then we have those knobs to tweak.
When redesigning Drakkar compared to GW1, where did the inspiration for the new look come from? That is a really great question, and Kate, our creature lead, could go into great detail about that. But from a high level, in GW1, you only saw Drakkar from kind of far away, and you never really got a good look at the detail of its form and what it was made of and really what it fully looked like. And so we had a bit of leeway to play with that to a degree. And so the two main inspirations that I recall was that they played with forms of whales. So you see a little bit of the jaw shape of a whale in Drakkar, and also the tail, which you don't ever see in Drakkar's model, but you see on the shadow. And then Kate really wanted to play with the idea that this Drakkar had been in the ice for a very long time between GW1 and now. And so that's where they played with how did Drakkar decay during that time? What did Jormung's influence, how did that influence the way that the decay was treated? And so you saw sort of shaggy fur, like almost like shag fur that was left out in the rain.
Okay.
And you saw like just blubber and just that was a big
Goo?
inspiration. Yeah, a lot of goo.
Okay. I have one that I had meant for us to talk about, and I forgot until just now. So if people saw the Let's Play that Clayton and I were doing, at the end, we were messing around after the fight and put out a bobblehead tonic.
Yes.
And that was just for fun. I didn't know this was going to happen. But when you put out a bobblehead tonic at the end of the Drakkar fight, what happens?
Yes, depending on where you're looking, it's not easy to miss. He's got a big old head, and it just kind of sticks out of the wall.
Right out of the ice.
Which kind of allows you to pull back the curtain a little bit. And
how does this happen?
yeah, so Drakkar is interesting. He's a complex encounter. The way that we ended up building him was that every single position where Drakkar can come out and be attacked or do an attack with the jaws attack from the ground or the one that comes out of the wall, those all have to be separate props, separate versions of him. And so the encounter with Drakkar is mechanically a bunch of them talking to each other and telling each other, hey, my health's at this point, so you're next up on the block, and so make sure your health is at this point. And when they deactivate, they're really, really far back. They play their animation to come back. And then the asset is still there, the prop is still there. So to get around making sure that you can't see him, when he comes back, we actually bone scale him down really, really, really small. But the bobblehead tonic seems to override this bone scaling, and so it takes the Drakkar that is deactivated, that's supposed to be hidden in smoke and mirrors, and just boop, shows his head right there. It's quite hilarious.
Yes. So my question, when we talked about this the other day, is that you said what you think might be happening is that the rest of the body is still bone scaled down.
Yes.
But the head is filling the entire chamber. Were you able to confirm this?
I cannot confirm or deny it. I'll let your imagination run wild.
It is.
I will say that the truth is far more interesting than you might think. But I'll have to get a screenshot in order to actually show you.
We have to go right now. No, but if you haven't yet, use a bobblehead tonic at the end of the Drakkar encounter because it's amazing. It looks like his giant head is mounted on the wall. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, did Jormung create Drakkar or only corrupt it? Is more of a narrative question. I don't think that's anything any of us can really speak to.
Yeah, I don't think we've answered that in game.
That's
Not sure if that's
a
something.
narrative question.
Yeah.
Well,
The audio guy seems to have an answer.
well, I know in the instance, the whispers inside
Mm-hmm.
Drakkar.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
That's as much as I.
But Drakkar
Okay.
itself.
I was like, Chris seems
That's
to
as close as
know.
I feel comfortable venturing
Okay.
to the maw.
Okay, well, I'm down.
Yeah, it does
Okay.
beg the question of, was Drakkar a natural creature that was then inhabited by the voice of Jormung, and that's why the corruption transformed the body or anything?
That is an extremely interesting question that I like a lot.
Yeah.
So, all right, we are approaching 1:30. It's getting late. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for spending some time with us. If you would like to spend some time with us in person and you are on the East Coast, we are heading out to PAX East next week. We'll be out on the show floor. We would love to see you guys. If you're heading out to PAX East, swing by the Guild Wars 2 booth on the show floor and we will see you there. Otherwise, we will see you next time on Guild Chat. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Bye.